After the funeral, my widowed boss knocked on my door at 12 a.m., and I already knew it was her before I opened it. Not because I expected her, but because I knew that knock. 3 floors up, apartment 4B, directly above mine, Elena Hartwell had been my neighbor for 2 years before she became my boss. I knew the sound of her heels on the hallway floor. I knew when she came home late. I knew, without ever being told, the rhythms of the life she shared with her husband behind that door. But tonight, the rhythm was wrong. It was 12 a.m. The funeral had been that afternoon, and my widowed boss, the woman who had stood at her husband's graveside in front of everyone without flinching, the woman who ran a company and lived 1 floor above me and had never once knocked on my door in 2 years of being neighbors, was standing in my doorway in her funeral dress, heels in her hand, with the look of someone who had climbed down 3 flights of stairs at midnight, because going back into that apartment above mine was something she simply could not do. She was my boss. She was my neighbor. She was a brand new widow, and I was the door she chose at 12 a.m. The question that never left me wasn't why a grieving woman couldn't face an empty apartment after a funeral. It was why, out of every neighbor in this building, out of every person in her world, my widowed boss knocked on my door. What happened inside that apartment above mine after the funeral guests left, and why, no matter how hard she tried to pretend that midnight knock never happened, she kept finding her way back. I had attended the funeral that afternoon with the rest of the staff, 40 people in dark clothes standing on wet grass, feeling the particular helplessness that comes when grief belongs to someone else and you have no idea what to do with your hands. Richard Hartwell was buried at 5 p.m. under a gray October sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or not. He was 42 years old. He had an easy smile, and he remembered every employee's name at every Christmas party. And 3 weeks ago, a wet road and a wrong curve ended everything he was and everything he was still supposed to become. I stood near the back. I always stood near the back. I watched Elena at the front, straight-backed, chin level, accepting condolences with a quiet grace that made the older women around me whisper about how strong she was. She shook hands. She nodded. She did not cry. Not once. Not where anyone could see. I thought about that on the drive home, about what it costs a person to hold that much together in public, about where all of it goes when the last guest finally leaves and the door closes and there's nobody left to perform strength for. I made dinner. I watched something on television I can't remember now. I went to bed before 11. The knock came at 12:04 a.m. 3 sounds. Slow. Deliberate. Not the frantic knocking of emergency and not the casual knock of someone stopping. By. Something in between. Something that had clearly been considered for a long time before the knuckles finally met the wood. I opened the door, and my brain needed a full 3 seconds to process what my eyes were seeing. Elena, still in her black funeral dress, heels hanging from 2 fingers, a small run in her left stocking she almost certainly hadn't noticed, her dark hair, always precise, coming loose at the edges in a way I had never seen in 2 years of sharing this building with her. She smelled faintly of candle wax and cold air, like someone who had sat very still in a quiet room for a very long time, and then suddenly couldn't anymore. She looked at me, and I saw it. Everything she had held together at that graveside, right there behind her eyes, pressing hard against the surface. "I know this is insane," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a thread pulled almost to its breaking point. "I just couldn't go back inside that apartment. I could have said a dozen things. I could have reminded her I was her employee. I could have mentioned that it was midnight, and we had never had a conversation longer than 3 minutes in 2 years of living in the same building. I could have asked her if she needed me to call someone more appropriate, someone family, someone equal to her. Instead, I said, 'Do you want to come in?' She did. She placed her heels neatly by the door, and something about that small act of precision in the middle of her falling apart broke something open in my chest. Even now, even at midnight, in the ruins of the worst day of her life, Elena Hartwell was exact about things. I made tea because it was the only thing my hands knew how to do. She sat on my couch and looked at the wall the way people look at things when they're not actually seeing them. I brought 2 cups and sat in the chair across from her, and did not try to fill the silence with words that would have been useless anyway. For a long time she said, nothing. Then, quietly, without looking at me, she said, he left voicemails, old ones on his old phone. After everyone left tonight, I just wanted to hear his voice, so I listened to them. She paused. The last one was recorded 3 days before the accident. Another pause, longer. He sounded different, like he was building up to something. And then he just stopped, said goodbye and hung up. She looked down at the cup in her hands. I played it 6 times. I still don't know what he was going to say. And now I never will. Her voice didn't break, but her hands tightened around the cup until her knuckles went pale. 11 years. I was married to that man for 11 years, and he died with a sentence he never finished, and I have to live inside that silence for the rest of my life. I didn't say it gets better. I didn't say at least you had 11 years. I didn't say anything, because nothing was the right thing, and somehow, in the way that some things are simply known, I understood that. So I just sat there, present, breathing, proof that the world still contains something other than grief. Around 2 a.m., her voice slowed and then stopped completely mid-sentence. I looked up and her eyes were closed. Her head tipped slightly against the back of the couch, the cup still loosely in her hands. I crossed the room carefully and took the cup before it could fall. I got my jacket from the hook by the door and laid it over her shoulders, gently, the way you do something you don't want to wake. I stood there for a moment looking at her. This woman who intimidated 40 people without trying. This woman who built something from nothing and wore her authority like a second skin. Completely still now, completely unguarded. Breathing slowly in my living room like it was the first safe place she'd found all day. Something moved in my chest in that moment, quiet and uninvited and impossible to put back. I pulled the jacket a little higher over her shoulder. Then I turned off the lamp and lay down on the floor with a pillow and closed my eyes. In the morning, she was gone. There was a note on my kitchen table, written on the back of a grocery receipt in her handwriting, clean and precise even in the middle of grief. Thank you. E. 2 words. I stood in my kitchen for a long time holding that receipt. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer by the sink, under everything else, in the place where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away. I told myself that was the end of it. A single night. A widow and a neighbor and a door that happened to be 1 floor below hers. I told myself she would be embarrassed when the grief cleared a little, that she would avoid the hallway when she heard my door, that things would go back to exactly what they were before, polite nods, professional distance, 2 people sharing a building without sharing anything real. But the next night at 12 a.m., the knock came again. She came back the next night at 5 minutes past midnight. No call, no warning. Just 3 knocks, the same 3 knocks, and when I opened the door, she was standing there in a gray sweater, hair down, eyes carrying the same weight as the night before, but quieter now. The raw shock had settled into something deeper, something that was going to take a long time to move through. "Is this okay?" she asked, and the way she asked it, carefully, like she genuinely wasn't sure she had the right, stopped me completely. This was Elena Hartwell. She didn't ask for things. She decided them. But she was standing at my door, asking if she was allowed to be there, and the smallness of it broke something open in me I wasn't prepared for. "Yes," I said. "Of course." She came back the night after that, and the night after that. By the end of the 2nd week, I had a spare blanket folded on the couch before she arrived. I knew she took her tea with honey, not sugar honey. I knew. She tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking hard. I knew the difference between her silences, the ones that meant she was processing and the ones that meant she was drowning and just needed another person in the room to keep her head above water. She talked about Richard, not the eulogy version, the real one. He burned everything he cooked and blamed the stove every time. He cried at nature documentaries and denied it immediately after with a completely straight face. And the Sunday drives, no destination, just driving, her navigating by instinct, always ending up somewhere that felt like it had been waiting for them. We stopped doing that, she said one night, watching rain drag down the window glass. We kept saying next month, next season, after this project. A long pause. There was always going to be a next time. No self-pity, just the plain, precise truth of it. That was the thing about Elena that kept catching me off guard. On the fourth night, she turned it around. "Tell me something real about you," she said. "You've been listening to me fall apart for 4 nights, and I don't know anything about you except that you make good tea and you know when not to talk." So I told her. The real version. The middle child nobody worried about. Design school because it was the only place I'd ever had a real voice. Diane, my ex, who left with one sentence I still hadn't fully recovered from. "You never fight for anything, Marcus. Not even me. The fresh start that turned out to be the same person in a different city." Elena was quiet when I finished. Then, "She was wrong." "Was she?" "You fight quietly. Quietly isn't the same as not at all." She looked at me steadily. "You've shown up every night for a woman you barely know. You make the tea before she asks. You fold the blanket before she arrives." A pause. "You pay attention, Marcus. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." I looked away before she could see my face. Because right there, in that moment, I stopped being able to lie to myself about what I was feeling. It wasn't compassion. It wasn't proximity. It was specific and undeniable and completely impossible. And I decided in that same moment that I would carry it alone for as long as I had to, because she was grieving, and the last thing she needed was one more thing to manage. She returned to work 5 weeks after the funeral. Charcoal blazer, heels on marble, hair perfect, posture saying everything it always said. The woman who had fallen asleep on my couch in her funeral dress was completely invisible. The midnight visits stopped without explanation. I made tea out of habit on the 4th night and caught myself standing in my kitchen with 2 cups and understood with a quiet, settled ache that the chapter had simply closed. I put the 2nd cup in the sink. I was almost at peace with it. Then Connor Hartwell appeared, Richard's younger brother, tall, protective, the look of a man who had decided someone needed guarding and appointed himself to the job. He found me in the parking garage on a Thursday evening, close enough to make the point, pleasant enough to make it worse. "I know she came to your apartment," he said, "after the funeral. More than once." He let that sit. "She's grieving. She's not herself. I'd hate for someone to take advantage of that." "I'd hate that too," I said. I held his gaze. Then I walked to my car. On Monday morning, Elena called me into her office, closed the door quietly, and reassigned me to a different floor without looking up from her desk. "It's a strong growth opportunity," she said. "Of course," I said. "Thank you." I walked out, took the elevator down, sat in my car and stared at the concrete wall in front of me. She hadn't transferred me out of cruelty. She'd transferred me out of fear. And somehow, that was so much worse. That night I lay in my apartment listening to the building. Breathe. Somewhere above me, 3 floors up, I heard her heels cross the floor of apartment 4B. Then, silence. I stared at my ceiling for a long time, and I finally understood something Diane had been trying to tell me for years, that there's a particular kind of pain that belongs only to people who feel everything and say nothing. 6 weeks of silence. 6 weeks of different floors, professional nods, and elevator doors closing between us before either of us had to decide whether to speak. 6 weeks of me doing exactly what I had always done my entire life. Shrinking myself, filing my feelings under later, letting someone walk away because I didn't know how to ask them to stay. I threw myself into work, took on extra projects, filled every quiet hour with something that wasn't thinking about her. It didn't work. Then, the company's annual client showcase arrived. Everyone in the same room, open bar. The kind of evening where professional distance is harder to maintain because the music is too warm and the lighting is too low, and the version of yourself you perform at your desk doesn't quite fit the space. I watched her from across the room all night. She moved through conversations like she was built for them, laughing at the right moments, holding her wine glass with that practiced ease, being exactly who the room needed her to be. She was extraordinary. She was also completely alone inside all of it, and I was probably the only person in that room who could see it. I stepped outside onto the terrace around 9 for air. She appeared 10 minutes later. We stood side by side at the railing without speaking. The city below us glittered like it had no idea anything was wrong. For a long moment, neither of us moved. "How's the Meridian account?" she asked finally. "Good," I said. "Good team." "Good." Silence. Then, quietly without looking at me, "I moved you because I was scared, Marcus." I turned to look at her. "Not because of anything you did. Because of me." She kept her eyes on the city. "I would sit in meetings and look at you and remember what it felt like to be a human being instead of just a function, and I couldn't afford that." She paused, so I did what I always do. I made a decision, and I executed it, and I told myself it was the right one. "Was it?" She finally looked at me. And in her eyes was everything she had been holding at arm's length for 6 weeks, complicated and exhausted and completely unresolved. "No," she said simply. She picked up her glass and went back inside before I could respond. I stood on that terrace alone, city spread out below me, and understood something with sudden crystalline clarity. She wasn't avoiding me because she felt nothing. She was avoiding me because she felt too much, and Elena Hartwell had spent her entire adult life treating her own feelings like a problem to be managed rather than a truth to be lived. She called me at 11:30 that same Friday night. No preamble, just, "Can I come over?" "Yes," I said. She arrived at midnight, not in a funeral dress this time. Jeans, a dark coat, the look of a woman who had been arguing with herself the entire drive over and had shown up anyway, which, I was learning, was the most Elena Hartwell thing she ever did. She stood in the far right middle of my living room and didn't sit. "I owe you the truth," she said. "Elena." Richard was going to leave me. The room went completely still. The voicemail, the distance, the months of being somewhere else in his head. She held my gaze steadily, the way she did when something cost her everything to say. After the funeral, I couldn't stand the not knowing, so I had someone look into it. A breath. He was going to ask for a divorce. He just hadn't told me yet. I couldn't speak. "So I'm not just a widow," she said. "I'm a woman whose husband was leaving her and then died before he could. And I've been carrying that alone for 2 months, because if I tell anyone, all they'll ever do is feel sorry for me. Or worse, judge him." Her hands were shaking. For the first time since I'd known her, Elena Hartwell's hands were visibly shaking. "I'm telling you because you're the only person who has never once tried to manage me. Not the grief, not the image, not the story. You just let me be whatever I was." I crossed the room. I took both her hands in mine and held them still. "You have been carrying this alone for 2 months," I said. "I'm used to carrying things alone." "I know you are." I looked at her, really looked at her. "But you don't have to be. Not here." Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not like the movies, just quietly, the way a door opens that has been closed for a very long time. "I'm a mess," she whispered. "I'm complicated, and I'm grieving, and I'm probably 2 years away from being someone you should actually get involved with." "I know," I said, "and you're my employee." "I know that too. So tell me why I can't stop coming back to this apartment." I looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had built something from nothing, who had stood at a graveside without flinching, who had climbed down 3 flights of stairs at midnight because my door was the only one that felt safe, and who was standing in front of me now asking a question she already knew the answer to. "Because some things don't wait for the right time," I said. "They just show up, at midnight, 3 floors down, and they knock." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden and unguarded and so completely unexpected that it transformed her face entirely, and I understood in that moment that I had never actually seen Elena Hartwell laugh before. Not really. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. When it faded, she was still close, and her eyes were soft in a way they had never been in any boardroom or any hallway or any professional moment we had ever shared. "I'm going to need you to be patient with me," she said quietly. "Some days the grief is going to be louder than everything else. Some days I'm going to pull away because pulling away is all I know how to do when I'm scared. I know, I said, and I'm going to need you. To fight for it, she said. I need to know you'll fight. I can't do this with someone who disappears when it gets hard. Diane's voice echoed somewhere in the back of my mind. You never fight for anything, Marcus. I looked at Elena, my boss, my neighbor, the woman who had knocked on my door at midnight in her funeral dress and, somewhere in the weeks that followed, had quietly become the most important person in my life. I'm not going anywhere, I said. She nodded slowly. Then she crossed to my couch, sat down in her spot at the one she had claimed the very first night, and tucked her feet under her. Then make me some tea, she said, and come sit with me. So I did. I made 2 cups. I sat next to her, not across from her, next to her, and we talked until 2 a.m. about Richard, about Diane, about the Sunday drives she was going to start taking again, about what it means to lose something and choose to keep living anyway. At some point, she fell asleep against my shoulder. And I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, this woman breathing softly beside me, and thought about how the most important things in life almost never arrive the way you planned them. They arrive at midnight, in a funeral dress, with shaking hands and an impossible story and 3 knocks on a door you almost didn't open. I hadn't opened it because I was brave. I opened it because something in those 3 knocks told me that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to matter. I was right. In the morning, she was still there. She didn't leave a note this time. She made breakfast. If this story moved you, if you've ever loved someone through their grief or been the person who needed a door to open at midnight, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And before you go, I want to ask you something. Is it possible to fall in love with someone in their worst moment? Or does real love only begin after the healing? Leave your answer in the comments below. You might be surprised how many people feel exactly what you feel.